Hi, I'm Dr. Lewis Hoffman from Saybrook University, and this video lecture is on personality, general themes, and a humanistic response. This lecture is being developed as part of a class on foundations and critique of contemporary psychology at Saybrook University. However, I wanted to make the video lecture open to whoever was interested in it, and it may be of interest to some people that are taking classes on theories of personality at other schools or programs, particularly if they want to see a little bit of a humanistic perspective. This is a brief overview, as this is a survey class intended to be an introduction to graduate level themes across psychology from a mainstream perspective, and then also providing a humanistic response. And so this is what the course does on personality. Let me talk a little bit then about some of my credentials for teaching this class. I've been teaching classes on theories of personality for over 10 years now at the undergraduate and graduate level at a number of different schools and programs. So I have quite a bit of background from that perspective. I've also done some professional writing and publishing from this perspective, particularly writing on existential and postmodern themes in understanding the self and personality, however also integrating in some other perspectives, particularly psychodynamic, when doing this. And then in addition to this, I have been a psychologist in private practice for a number of years and have done a number of psychological assessments. And as part of those, there often are requests or needs to do personality assessment with that. So I've also approached personality from that perspective. So I've approached personality from a number of different ways within kind of a Western paradigm, and also have been heavily involved in international psychology for the last 6-7 years. And so I have some interest in critiques of ideas of self, personality from an international perspective, as there are significant differences between Eastern and Western perspectives on particularly the self that I'll talk about some in this class, in this lecture. But again, this is a pretty brief lecture that's a general overview. Okay, these are the topics that we're going to talk about. What is personality in the self? And I'll offer some brief general definitions. Approaches to personality in contemporary psychology. Why do we need to consider personality, and what are the implications of these theories? The self and personality in an East-West context. Reification, fundamentalism, and other personality theory dangers. And then some humanistic and existential perspectives on personality, and also integrate in a few ideas from transpersonal at that point. So in talking some about the essential definitions, what is personality in the self? Well, this varies from theory to theory. And so there's different definitions and different assumptions across the various theories. This is quite notable, for example, if you look at the differences between Freud and Jung and their understanding and definition of the self. So there always need to be considerations of the theoretical differences within psychology. However, there's also some important cultural implications. Much of what we discuss in this lecture is based upon Western culture perspectives. Indeed, much of what has been developed in psychology today, particularly Western psychology today, is heavily influenced by Western culture and Western perspectives on the self and personality that don't always apply to Eastern approaches. So we'll talk about this some. And I'm going to begin by suggesting a very general definition of personality and the self. And let me share a little bit about how I came up with these. These are definitions that I wrote. And I came up with these by reviewing a large number of definitions of personality and the self, and personality theory and theories of personality texts, intro to psychology texts, history of psychology texts, and then also some other scholarly literature. And in going across those, I tried to come up with a definition that was as best as possible inclusive of the many different important themes. However, in trying to integrate all of those different things, there's always going to be some failures and limitations in doing that. I share these not in suggesting them as the right or correct definition. I don't know if there is such a thing. If so, I'd be skeptical that anyone has come up with it as yet. I would not even say that I agree with all of these definitions, but I do think they are a pretty good attempt to synthesize a lot of the general themes that are important when considering the self and personality. Let me start with a definition of the self then. The self can be understood as a social and/or personal construction of personal identity. The self implicitly assumes that there are some type of boundaries between an individual self and the outside world, including other beings. The self boundaries are implicit, even if beliefs in shared qualities or aspects of the self, such as spiritual or collective unconscious, or the ability to transcend these boundaries, such as transpersonal experiences. So let me come back and break this down a little bit. So the social or personal construction, this is a tipping of the hat to some of the postmodern, I'd also say existential perspectives on the self and personality that do assume that there are some influences based on culture, social influences, and personal beliefs that may impact what is perceived or experienced as a self. Some postmodern perspectives even go as far as suggesting that there is no such thing as a centered self or a unified self, and that we should instead be thinking of multiple selves within individuals. Now, the self implicitly assumes there's some type of boundary, so some type of distinction between oneself and the outer world is part of the idea of self generally. This is true even if there are beliefs about shared qualities. And I share qualities, what I'm talking about is things from out there in the world that have an impact or are also part of the self. So the collective unconscious could be an example of that. There are some spiritual beliefs that we are all interconnected in certain ways that could be seen as something external impacting the individual. And also there may be the ability to transcend these boundaries at times, such as talked about in transpersonal, some humanistic and other spiritual perspectives, including perspectives that integrate altered states, that suggest that we're able to sometimes go beyond our boundaries of the self into the other world or deeper connections beyond ourself. Now, these ideas that suggest that there's something outside coming in or inside that connects outside doesn't mean that there's no boundaries, but rather suggests that the boundaries are rather permeable in some perspectives. In other perspectives, they're very boundaried, and a breakdown of the self would be seen as something that is really problematic. So there are various things to consider with this, but that some type of boundary is important regardless of whether there's some way to connect or go beyond those boundaries. Now, when we look at personality, it is often thought, probably generally thought in Western perspectives, that the personality is something that flows from the self, though not always. Sometimes it's seen the other way, or they're seen just as distinct. However, a general definition of personality could refer to patterns of internal experiences, thoughts and feelings, as well as behaviors, broadly understood, which tend to maintain consistency over time. Changes in personality are generally gradual and slow if they are believed to occur at all. And so personality generally refers to some type of pattern, sometimes called traits or characteristics, dimensions of personality, and these generally refer to thoughts and feelings or behaviors. And again, the way that thoughts, feelings, behaviors are defined varies from theory to some degree, but a variety of types of patterns related to the self. It is generally thought that personality changes are gradual, with allowing for some exceptions at times, if they're believed to occur at all. Freud was pretty pessimistic about the idea of personality changes, for example. He didn't think we made significant changes. Many of you have probably heard that in regard to personality disorders, a lot of people believe that personality disorders such as borderline personality disorders never change, despite there being some research that these personalities do change. But a lot of people believe that if you're diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder or borderline personality, you may be able to change some behaviors but not the basic personality. Some early psychoanalytic theorists thought that personality was basically established at a very young age, some advocating as early as 2, some advocating as early as 6, that the basic blocks of personality are established at that time. Other theorists believe that personality is established in genetics and we never really change from those genetics. Most would say that there are at least some genetic and environmental aspects that influence the development of personality, regardless of whether they think the personality can change or not. there's been some changes in the kind of the general consensus where it used to be much more pessimistic about significant changes in personality, and increasingly there's a lot more theories that will advocate that personality can change over time. Psychoanalytic thought is a great example. That early psychoanalytic thought tended to be pretty pessimistic about personality changes, and now if you look at some of the contemporary and relational psychoanalytic theories, as well as a number of other psychoanalytic theories, they do believe that you can change. Humanistic and existential theories have always been pretty optimistic about such changes. So there have been some changes over time. Again, let me remind you, I suggest these definitions as integrative definitions, drawing upon a lot of the definitions that are out there in the field, not as the right definitions or my definitions or the definitions that you should take on, but they do point to some of the important themes to be aware of when talking about personality. Approaches to personality in contemporary psychology. Personality theory versus theories of personality. These two terms basically can be meaning the same things and often used interchangeably. But if you just do a look at the textbook on personality theory versus textbook that talk about theories of personality, you're going to see a general distinction. Personality theory generally is going to look more at a research-based approach. It's not going to look at a existential or psychodynamic perspective necessarily, but it's going to look more at just a research-based, looking at certain types of traits or qualities or patterns of behavior or characteristics. Some of the common examples of this are, looking at the Big Five approach to personality. A lot of the personality measures are based off of research perspectives, such as the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, now in its second edition. There's also the Milan, which is the MCMI, the 16PF, the Myers-Briggs, as well as a number of others. The Myers-Briggs was developed based off of Jungian theory and has been researched some over time. It's one that most of the measures, most Myers-Briggs measures, the measures of Jungian personality seem to not be as stable over time, which some are critical of, but then if you believe the personality can change, is a little more fluid, adjusts the context, then this would also make sense that a measure would do this, and that maybe isn't as problematic in some senses. But this is an example of some of the research perspective. Theories of personality generally begin in the theoretical ideas, often emerging from more qualitative approaches to trying to understand personality, and they may then be researched some over time, such as happened with Jungian and the Myers-Briggs. So but they emerge more from that theory, and we talk about different theoretical approaches. And the research may help to change or adapt these theories, but they tend to remain somewhat consistent over time. So examples of these are psychoanalytic and behavioral and humanistic personality theories. And why do we need to consider personality? Well, we all have implicit theories of personalities, even if we're not aware of it. And these may change some over time. But even more importantly, these implicit theories of personality will impact us. They will impact the way that we interact with people. And I would say even more, they should impact us. Let me give some examples of this. Humanistic theory has an assumption that people are basically good. Well, an approach to therapy is built off of this. And in some ways we could say that in humanistic theory, what we're trying to do is provide some basic conditions of therapy in order to help people become more of themselves. Well, now, if your implicit theory of personality is one in which you believe people are basically bad, then you don't want to apply a humanistic approach to therapy that encourages people to become more themselves. So there are some important differences that should have some implications. Humanistic, again, has this belief that people are basically good. Psychoanalytic, historically, particularly in the early thoughts, was pretty pessimistic about human nature, thought that people weren't basically good. As a matter of fact, Freud thought that for much of our history, if not for religion and other social pressures, we basically would have killed ourselves off. And these, religion, which Freud was pessimistic about in the end, he did think served a purpose, that it provided certain types of roles and rules that helped contain these very dangerous aspects of our nature. For it hoped that eventually we would no longer need this, that we would rise above needing religion to help keep us from killing ourselves off. But for a long part of history, he believed it was something that was necessary. Existential views take a little bit more of a middle road, as we'll talk about later, in thinking that people are basically good, but also acknowledging that potential for evil. So now when we look at these three different theories with different assumptions, and let me highlight again that these all have changed over time. Psychoanalytic doesn't necessarily agree with Freud that we're going to kill ourselves off if not for religion or some other thing to contain us. And there's a lot of variation within, but the assumptions related to these are going to guide the way that we do things, the way we're going to live our lives, the way we're going to treat people, the way we're going to do our practice in psychology, whether that be as consultants, therapists, or whatever. So these theories should guide our practice. They inform how we diagnose and conceptualize. As the time I'm writing this, giving this lecture on the video lecture, is around the time that the DSM-5 is coming out, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, published by the American Psychiatric Association. And this has been strongly criticized by a number of different organizations, and Humanistic Psychology and the Society for Humanistic Psychology, which is a division of APA, has led the way in a lot of these critiques. However, the British Psychological Association, the American Counseling Association, a number of organizations have voiced strong concern about the DSM. For a long time, many professionals in mental health just practiced with the assumption that the DSM was a good thing, and that it was reflecting some type of truth or something close to truth. There's always been dissenters, but for a long time there was a lot of agreement around this. With the DSM-5, that's changing a lot, that a lot of people are critical, and there's been an increasing number of people suggesting that we should boycott or find alternatives to the DSM. Some psychoanalytic individuals created an alternative with the Psychoanalytic Diagnostic Manual, the PDM, and there is talk about a larger organization coming up with alternatives or switching to use of the ICD-9, or actually I think the ICD-10 now is coming out. So there are some questions about diagnosis. But regardless of whether we use the DSM or not, there's lots of ways that we conceptualize and diagnose beyond that. And these are influenced a lot by the theories that we have and the personality theories that we have. And there's a lot of assumptions in these, and we'll talk about some of the limitations in these in a little bit. But all of the theories are going to influence how we see what is healthy and what is not healthy. And so that then will guide what is our approach to treatment or intervention. Now, obviously, if you think people are basically bad, you don't want to use an intervention that's going to help them come more of themselves, such as humanistic. You might use an intervention that puts a little bit more power authority in the therapist to try and influence the people in ways that fit what is socially appropriate, encouraging people to adjust to social norms, thinking that what are the social norms is generally what is good. Whereas a humanistic approach might take a little different perspective on that, thinking that what the norms of society aren't necessarily what's best for everyone, and that because people are basically good, we can trust them, even if they are different or unique, to become more of themselves. So hopefully this makes some sense as to the importance of being aware of our theories. For a while in psychology, many people were saying, we don't need to learn about theories or philosophy or any of that. We just need to learn how to practice and what works. But this is naive. It's very naive in my view, because our theories are going to impact and influence us. And if we're not aware of how they're doing that, that can be dangerous. So one of the important things, if you're going into the field of psychology, whether it be as a therapist or another role, it is very important that we're aware of our own implicit theories of personality and beliefs about people. Now, some of the East versus West perspectives. As I've mentioned some already, personality in the self in Western psychology is built upon Western, and in particular individualized conceptions of people, often with an implicit bias. It's often talked about that there's been a bit of a white male standard in Western psychology. This is written about some in the book, which is an excellent book I would highly recommend, by Guthrie, called Even the Rat Was White. And in this conception, basically what is common among white males, particularly white males in authority positions or in higher statuses in society, are what perceived to be what everyone should aspire to. And so the standards of what people should aspire to is built off of this perspective. Well, obviously, this is a very culturally and gender insensitive perspective and a very biased perspective. But much of psychology has been built upon it. And we've had the critiques, but I don't know that we've seen significant shifts in our understanding of psychology from this yet. And I think we still have a long way to go on this. We still need more critiques. We need feminist and womanist critiques that will address some of the masculine biases that are present and implicit in much of Western psychology. And we need cultural critiques that look at a lot of the biases towards Western white perspectives. We need gender perspectives that critique from LGBTQ perspectives that are looking at the implicit bias towards heterosexual perspectives that is in the foundation of much of Western psychology. So there are many limitations that we can look at. These become highlighted quite well in looking at Eastern and Western. I don't think Eastern and Western is the only type of critiques that we should bring forward. We need to look at critiques much more broadly than that. But I think these are some of the perspectives that can help illustrate this concept of the need for critique. Mosig provides a really good article discussing this. It's listed in the references that I'll put up at the end, and I highly recommend this article. I think it's a really important article, and it's unfortunate that I haven't seen it cited more often than what it has been. But part of what he talks about is that in the West, we often build our conceptions of health based upon a particular perspective that believes that self-esteem and independence are the ideals for health. But what he points out is that in the East, there's a very different perspective. That in the East, for example, in Buddhism, holding on too tightly to the self is seen as a problem, a spiritual problem and a psychological problem. And focusing too much on the individual can be seen as a problem or pathological. Elevating the individual too much and the individual choices too much can be seen as a problem or pathological. Disrespectful of the family unit. So here we can see that some basic assumptions in Western psychology are quite in contradiction to many Eastern values. But yet what we've seen, and I've seen this a lot in doing international psychology, particularly international psychology in China, is most people from the West go to China with these assumptions and they don't even talk about them. They seem unaware of these differences, and they impose this Western perspective on the self and personality onto Eastern cultures. And we've done some dialogues, for example, when talking about existential psychology in China with some of the psychoanalytic perspectives. And to be quite honest, I've been very frustrated and disappointed quite often with some of the psychoanalytic perspectives. I have a lot of respect for psychoanalytic theory. I integrate a lot of it into what I do. I've taught courses on it. It's not that the psychoanalytic theory is the problem. The problem is that I think psychoanalytic theory, when it's been introduced to China, has not taken the time to ask for a cultural critique. When we've gone in from an existential perspective, what we've done is said, listen, we know that there's limitations and that there's aspects of our assumptions of existential psychology from the West that don't fit, and there's aspects that need to be adapted. And we've asked for people in China to provide those critiques and help us think about, if existential psychology is going to be applied in China, how would it need to be adapted to be done in a culturally sensitive way? Just in the limited experience I've seen with a couple of groups doing psychoanalytic work in China, I've not seen that same respect for the Chinese culture there. I've not seen the same intent about trying to adapt psychoanalytic to Chinese culture. I'm hopeful that there are some that have done that, and maybe it's just the limited group that I've interacted with. But this is a really important issue. And it's not just an important issue when we're doing international psychology. It has relevance when we're working in the United States. Many cultural groups, African American, Latino, Latina, also have different conceptions of the self and relationships, different perspectives that would show some concern about the individualistic bias that is implicit in much of Western psychology. So we need to be aware of these things. And personality is just one of the many ways that we can recognize dangers of imposing a Western psychology on other cultures, and even many of the individuals within Western culture. And this bias is there too in humanistic, existential, and transpersonal, which is part of why when we've gone to China relevant to existential psychology, we've been very intentional about asking for the critique and helping us see what we can't see, because we're going to have some blind spots from our culture. I'm going to use a couple quotes here, this transition, and this I think talks to what I was just talking about, but also we'll talk to the next point that I will get to. It's a quote by Rolla May. A historical perspective can also help free us from the ever-present danger, especially a danger in the social sciences, of absolutizing any theory or method which is actually relative to the fact that we live at a given moment in time in our development of a particular culture. So what May is talking about here is that all of our theories, even all of our science, is contextually influenced, contextually laden. And we cannot assume that because a theory was accurate at one time that it will always be accurate. There may be changes. Theories need to evolve. We always need to be open to that. That doesn't mean we should disregard the past. I would say rather that a proper honoring of history is recognizing that history provides a recognition of how we need to change and adapt as well. So I think this is a powerful quote by Rolla May, pointing to historical and cultural limitations when talking about personality. Nietzsche, philosophical systems, and I think we could say the same for personality theories. Philosophical systems are wholly true only wholly true for their founders only. Let me try that again. Philosophical systems are wholly true for their founders only. Now, I would maybe add on that I'm not even sure that they're wholly true for the founders, because we always have a bit of limitation and self-deception that creeps its way in. But what this does point to that I think is quite important is that our theories of personality always to some degree reflect us. And so when we look at the theories of personality and the developers, we often see that they reflect the individuals quite highly, as much as the general, and probably more than the general. And so personality theories that are developed by a single individual have some very strong limitations. It's important that we bring in a broader dialogue and discussion to help adapt the theories, to help see the limitations and blind spots, and help make them more robust and applicable to different individuals and situations. And that should be a continual, ongoing process. Now let me talk quickly about reification. And let me give a quote. This is from Mosig again, about reification, to help explain what is meant by this term. Reification is the process by which the mind makes a thing or a material object out of a concept or abstraction. By extension, it is making a thing out of a form, shape, or configuration, a gestalt, a perception, or an image. It is to thing an event or phenomenon, to transform an ongoing fluid process into a frozen, static, spatial, or temporal cross-section of the same, endowing such construction with qualities of reality and separateness. So this has got a number of important implications here. Let me see if I can speak to some of them, but I'm going to break this down a little bit in order to do this. So reification is to create a thing out of something that is not a thing, is part of what Mosig is saying here. To create a thing out of something that is not actually originally a thing. So we could apply this to personality or the self even, and say that personality is something, oops, let me see if I can bring that back up here. That personality is something that we, in essence, reify, that we make. and particularly when we look at personality in isolation. So if we think of personality as a more fluid process, as would be argued in humanistic, what we could say is that what we do with personality a lot of times is we take a very narrow cross-section of time and we say then, this is personality. This is who the person is. And we forget about all of this from the past and all the direction it's going in the future that influences the individual. So this is a significant limitation that we can talk about then in terms of how we conceive personality quite often. We see this in personality assessment in particular. I mentioned before that I've done a lot of psychological testing and assessment across my career in a number of different contexts. And I always had some hesitations in this, and when I would write up the reports, I would always try to be rather explicit in speaking to this, that the person is a changing, evolving person over time, so as to help whoever read the report recognize that I'm not saying that this is who the person is for all time. But what we often do when we look at personality assessment is we have this assumption that people don't really change. And so if someone was given an MMPI 10 years before, we expect it's going to be fairly similar 10 years later. And we often assume that. It's not always the case. Often it is, but it's not always the case. Change does tend to be rather slow for most people in terms of personality. For some people it's more rapid, but it does tend to be slow. But we should not mistake the slowness in change for no change at all. And so this is a lot of what Mosig is talking about here, is that we're taking something that is fluid, that is static, that is in motion, and we are viewing it and talking about it as if it was something that was static, something that was a thing, like a rock that doesn't move at all. So reification, fundamentalism, and other personality theory challenges them. Well, there are dangers when we hold too tightly to a theory of personality, even if it's humanistic. Theories can help us illuminate, but they can also help hide or blind us. Ernest Becker talks about this, I think, quite nicely in his book, The Denial of Death. He doesn't talk about it quite that directly, but he will talk about Freud's theory and his psychosexual theory in particular, and talk about the limitations of it and how everything gets forced into interpreting it through that lens. And so this helps us see some things, and I think it's very accurate to say that Freud helped us see many things that were being denied and ignored. He helped people to recognize the influence of our sexuality in many ways. Even if you don't agree with his theories, he did help us give more attention and more consideration to sexuality and illuminated some things. Though the conceptions of the unconscious were around long before Freud, we can also see that Freud did help for us to give more attention to and to understand the influence of the unconscious much better than what had been historically the case. So Freud's theories helped us illuminate a lot of things, but it also blinded us to a number of things because it forced everything into that conception. And so Becker talked about how the basic denial that Freud talked about was our sexuality, but Becker said that he believed that it was more our fear of death and a denial of death that was this root. Now maybe it's not just one thing too, maybe it's multiple things, and it's oversimplistic to talk about any one thing. And with both Freud's sexuality and Becker's conception of death, we could see that these have much greater applicability if we view them as symbols, that we see sex as a symbol of life and life energy, and if we see, or possibly a symbol of reflection, intimacy, and connection, as a lot of the later relational psychoanalytic people interpret it, and death if we see it as reflective of all human limitation, not just the literal death, well then these have much greater applicability. But if we interpret Freud's theory as just being about sex in a very literal way, we've just reduced its ability to help us illuminate greatly. But if we can expand our understanding of it and combine it with other theories, then we can start to see how it can help illuminate much more. And when we come into dialogue across cultures or across theories and get different conceptions of personality and self, again, this can help illuminate things that the theories that we hold on to are going to miss. So while it's good to have a theoretical home and foundation that we use, particularly if we're in the field of psychology and using something to work from, we need to hold on to these in a way that we're open to changing them, to adapt them, to critically think about them and reflect on them on an ongoing basis. Not just at the beginning, but at an ongoing basis as we apply these. Otherwise, our theories become blinders. And if we become fundamentalists around our theory, it really becomes problematic. So let me talk a little bit then about some humanistic perspectives and contributions. I've referred to some of these to a degree already, though maybe not as explicitly. Well, from a humanistic perspective, personality is seen as fluid, not stagnant. It changes over time and adapts over time, and this is seen as a good thing. People are seen as basically good, which we've talked about already. I made reference to this. However, what I didn't talk about as much is that culture corrupts, and this will be important in just a minute as I talk about some distinctions between humanistic and existential. Is in a very famous dialogue between Rollo May and Carl Rogers, this was one of the points of contention, and why in the end Rollo May said that he had to think of himself first as an existential psychologist and not a humanistic psychologist, though he'd been very involved in the development of humanistic psychology in many ways. So according to Rogers, culture is what corrupts us. It's the influence from outside that creates what is evil. May respond to this in saying, well, how did it get into culture if not through people? But that we'll get to in just a second. So the humanistic perspective, again, people are basically good. Now, building from that, Rogers advocated that people will flourish in a healthy environment. So if we create the right conditions, such as Rogers' necessary and sufficient conditions for therapy services, if we build these, then the person will grow in a positive direction. So the environment is really key. And Rogers talked about pathology then to some degree in terms of conditions of worth, that we have internalized things from our relationships, often with parents or others, about where we develop these assumptions about we need to have certain conditions in order to be seen as worthy by other people. Now, this is not all of a humanistic perspective on personality, but it's some of the more important contributions. Let me compare this then a little bit with an existential perspective on personality. There's a lot more that is the same between humanistic and existential perspectives than different, but there are differences, and we shouldn't just ignore the differences. So existential also believes that people are basically good, but emphasizes the importance of being aware of limitations and the potential for evil that's inherent in the human condition. There's a book chapter that I wrote recently with Abraham Lopez and Michael Motes that addresses this some. It's the chapters on self-awareness, but what it delineates some is this difference between the humanistic and the existential based on some of the perceptions of what it means to be human and how that impacts then the way that we try and accept ourselves, or the way that we view self-acceptance. So this potential for good and potential for evil is important. It's also, as I mentioned, in the famous dialogue between Rogers and May is illustrated, I think, beautifully. Another important aspect from an existential perspective that I think fits well with a lot of humanistic perspectives too is Schneider's idea of the importance of paradox, and his major contribution in this area is a book called Paradox of Self, and really emphasizes that throughout our nature we can see this as a lot of things as paradoxical. This is different than how we often see as the continuum approaches. Like we often see, like on the continuum approach, individualism, collectivism, introvert, extrovert. Now what Schneider is saying is that we all have these, and what we want to do more is integrate these aspects of ourselves. We want to integrate our introvert and extrovert, integrate the individual and the collective, so that they're not these two poles that we fall more on one side or more the other. definitely some people and some cultures are more individualistic and more collectivist, but that doesn't mean that we don't all both have some individualistic and collectivist aspects to ourselves. And when we see them as a continuum, we tend to isolate the individual from the collective, the introvert from the extrovert, instead of seeing that they can actually be something that work together. Now, a few colleagues and I integrating then cultural, some postmodern, and some existential views, particularly Schneider's, and really was building upon Schneider's to bring in more of a cultural perspective and respond to some postmodern critiques to the idea of the self. Developed some ideas around the idea of myths of self. And the myths of self is really intended to suggest some fluidity. And by myths of self, it's important to mention quickly about myths. The way that Rollo May talked about myths was he distinguished, saying that myths are not something that are false, which is often what we believe in our culture, but rather they are something that can't be proven true, and often they are things that are symbolically true. So when I'm talking about myths of self, I'm not saying that the self is a myth. I'm saying rather that people have different conceptions of the self. And these conceptions of the self, what is going to be healthy for one person is going to be not healthy for another. So there is no universal understanding, no universal idea of what is a healthy individual. And this is particularly important when we consider cultural perspectives. And I think this is a way that existential therapy and existential perspectives can, and humanistic too, can begin to move beyond some of the Western biases. If we start to move towards viewing myths of self instead of the individual self, which is implicit in a lot of humanistic thought and existential thought, then we can allow for greater flexibility. What is going to be conceived as healthy for one person is not healthy in the other, as I mentioned. So what is considered a healthy understanding of self for someone in a collectivist culture is going to be different from someone in an individualistic culture. And within the individualistic and collectivist cultures, there's going to be a lot of variation. So we shouldn't impose one healthy view of the self or personality upon individuals, but rather help them create some of their own understandings of what is healthy and their own experiences of what is healthy. An example of this that I think is quite nice builds off of Buchenthal's idea of being a part of and being a part from. And looking at being a part of and apart from, Buchenthal said we have both of these needs, which I think can be seen symbolically in these ideas of individualism and collectivism. It's not the same thing as individualism and collectivism, but I think along the same line as symbolically as these. So Buchenthal would say we have needs to be a part of and apart from, to be recognized as an individual, but to be seen as part of a group. And this is going to be true for people in the West and in the East, individualist and collectivist. So in the West, we tend to focus more on that being apart from. And it may be healthier for people to be a bit more individualistic in the West because of that, because that's our cultural norms. That's how we were brought up. We've been living with these influences. We may move some towards more collectivist. Or in collectivist culture, it may be healthier to be more a part of, to focus more on that, to have one's identity more strongly being a part of. But yet still need some of that individualistic. The extremes are dangerous when we don't integrate, as was talked about in that paradox. That is what can be unhealthy, whether in individualistic or collectivist. But both individualistic and collectivist can be quite healthy. And so I think this is a way for us, again, to start moving beyond it some in personality. Let me give an illustration with a friend of mine from China. His name is Suifu Wang, and he's done some writing that has been quite important, I think, and some of it's been translated to the West, and his ideas are getting introduced more and more to existential psychology in the West. But for Suifu, he grew up in a very collectivist culture, and he is a bit more of an individualist himself, that he values some of the individualistic aspects, but also he still really values some of the collectivist aspects and the traditional aspects of his culture. And so he's critiqued his culture some. And he's very Chinese in many ways, but also he's probably a bit more individualistic than many people in China. And in that way, he's able to speak to other people that have had some similar struggles and have been seeking out a little more of their own independent identity quite a bit more. But so he's come from this collectivist environment and moved a bit more towards the individualistic. And what is healthy for him on that integration is probably different from a lot of people in China. Now, similarly for me, I grew up in a very individualistic culture, and a lot of my upbringing was very individualistic. And there's many ways I still identify very much with that. But having married someone that comes from a more collectivist culture, and having spent a lot of time in China, as well as just a basic relational orientation, has brought me to really admire and desire more of this collectivist. So I've integrated probably a lot more of the collectivist in many ways than some other people in Western culture, and particularly probably more so than a lot of people in existential and humanistic psychology through these different experiences. And so Swayfu and I have talked some about how one of the reasons why we connect very well is because we both, in a sense, journeyed from our culture or norms in ways to be a little bit outside of that normal bear curve, more towards an outlier, not an extreme outlier, but a bit of an outlier. And in doing that, we've come to a place where, in some ways, we kind of meet in the middle, so to speak. There's some breakdown in that metaphor. We kind of meet in the middle and have a lot of shared values and agreement based upon that. I think we both have tremendous respect for our own culture and each other's culture, and have given a lot of consideration to that and how it has influenced us. We've both been able to critique our own culture and some of the limitations of it, while at the same time valuing much about our culture. And so this, I think, gives a bit of an illustration of some humanistic and existential themes. Just to speak briefly to the transpersonal, I apologize I didn't put a slide for this. But transpersonal is also going to talk much about those spiritual qualities. I think that can be quite important. This can relate to the collective unconscious and other spiritual connection perspectives of us being interconnected, as well as alternate states of consciousness. Some of these themes are going to come in as being more important also in transpersonal psychology. So I think there's some things that transpersonal has to offer. It's something that a lot of mainstream psychology maybe is a little more resistant to, even more resistant than the humanistic and existential perspectives, which fall outside of the mainstream. But yet, nonetheless, I think transpersonal psychology has some important critiques of Western psychology that I hope get more consideration over time. Okay. So this is the references that I mentioned. There were some other books that I made reference to and theorists such as Bugenthal and Ernest Becker, but these are the ones that I cited in the slides. Thank you.